This is Duke University.
Rob Schofield is the Director of Research at NC Policy Watch, a special news and commentary project of the North Carolina Justice Center. He joined the project in 2006 and has more than 3 decades of experience as a lawyer, lobbyist, writer, and trainer. He's a graduate of the George Washington University Law School and received his undergraduate degree from UCLA. Emily Seawell is a voting rights staff attorney with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, a nonpartisan nonprofit law firm in Durham. As a staff attorney, she's been involved in recent litigation challenging voter suppression and redistricting laws in North Carolina and across the South on behalf of clients, including the NAACP, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, and A. Philip Randolph Institute. And she'll be talking, there's a lot more here about the suits that they've been involved in, but I think we'll be talking about some of those today. Emily received her law degree from Elon University and is originally from Gastonia, North Carolina. So thanks to both of you for participating today.
Thanks for having us.
So I gather that you are going to be requested to speak into that.
Use the microphone.
So we're just gonna start off today with a general question.
All right.
A really general question to let you tell us. What do you think we need to know about the state of voting rights today from your perspectives, from the things that you're working on? We're talking particularly in North Carolina and to broaden it out to the United States as necessary.
I think we should say at the outset that Emily is the real expert here. And is the real lawyer who, although I am an attorney, Emily actually practices law in this area and is truly steeped in, has expertise in this field. And so I'm definitely playing second fiddle to her today. But I'm here to talk also about sort of the politics of what's going on in North Carolina, the war that I think has been waged by folks on the right against voting rights and what it's about. So. I don't know where to begin. Do you want to start first? Do you want to go first, Emily? Do you want me to?
Sure. Now that my bus has arrived, I'll go under it.
Go for it, please.
In North Carolina, since really starting in 2012, we have seen a wave of changes that have rolled back voting rights. And that's happened in 2 ways. We've seen what's called voter suppression, so things like voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, basically cuts to keep people from being able to exercise their right to vote. When you show up, for some reason, it's harder to vote. That's the voter suppression bucket.
And I should say, I made copies of a document that the group Democracy North Carolina produced back in 2013 or 14 about the so-called monster voting law, which really was the omnibus legislation passed in North Carolina that attempted to restrict the franchise. Most of it's been struck down by the courts, but sort of a nice summary, and maybe y'all want to grab a copy at some point.
Right.
Okay.
And so aside from the voter suppression bucket, we have the redistricting bucket that determines which elections you actually even get to vote in before you get to the level where you show up and it's harder for you to vote. And so we've seen redistricting happening at multiple levels. We've seen congressional redistricting, state legislative redistricting, local city councils, local school boards, county commissions. We're now seeing a press for judicial redistricting to redraw all the districts for superior court judges and district court judges in North Carolina. There have also been changes to appellate court elections and how we elect our Court of Appeals and our Supreme Court and how big those courts are. So we've seen a push across all sides, and it's just a little bit of an incremental push. And with each of these pushes, there has been a piece of litigation challenging it, and the courts have tried to slow it down, and that's been the challenge. Can the courts slow it down in time that it's not in effect for the next election? And so we've kind of been wrestling with this from the legal side, trying to get these measures to not be in place, to be enjoined during elections while these cases are slowly working their way through the court system. Judge James Wynn of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has been a judge on a number of these cases. And he said in a hearing last month to the legislature's attorneys, he said, this is a brilliant legal strategy that you have, because every time we strike something down, you come back with something that is unconstitutional in a slightly different way, and we have to start all over. And that stays in place for the next elections. And this is how you're holding on to powers. And he said the court system is failing the voters of North Carolina. So there's a challenge on our side. How do we get this slowed down and stopped enough that it's not, these things that are eventually going to be found unconstitutional How do we keep them from being in place the whole time in the meantime? Because it's 2017, and we're still fighting over laws that were enacted in 2011 in the courts.
And here are a few statistics, I think, that maybe sort of, I just prepared these yesterday in anticipation of today's event. I think it sort of reveals North Carolina's long and rich history of voter suppression and particularly as targeted towards people of color. As of 2015, the U.S. Census estimated that the racial distribution for North Carolina's population was 71.2% white, 22.1% African American, 1.6% American Indian, 2.8% Asian, 9.1% Hispanic or Latino of any race. This actually reflects a gradual decline in the African American population. In 1900, the census estimated that North Carolina was 68% white and 31.6% African American. But it's slowly declined, the African American population, but it still remains very large. And this is particularly true in eastern North Carolina counties, many of which have very high proportions of African American voters. Now consider these numbers. In the history of North Carolina has sent 333 individuals to Congress. Of that number, 9, or around 2.7%, have been African American. And that includes 4 who served during Reconstruction. So all 5 of the others, Representatives Clayton, Watt, Balance, Butterfield, and Adams, have been elected in the past 25 years. State legislature, very similar numbers, didn't elect an African American member until 1969. We've had 0 senators, 0 governors, 1 member of the Council of State, 1 House Speaker, 0 Senate presidents, et cetera. So, I mean, I think those numbers, just in and of themselves, I think are very powerful, and they sort of illuminate and make clear how dramatic the disenfranchisement of people of color, particularly African Americans in North Carolina, has been as a historical matter. And tragically, that's the same fight we're having even in 2017. It's the same issue really before us today. So anyway, that's sort of some background on where the heck we are.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't sound so good.
Not from our perspective.
So Emily, you brought up something that I think often gets missed when we think, this big question of voting rights, which the local, there are all these levels of voting that happens and all the different types of elections that we're voting in. And I wonder if you could maybe go a little deeper into that, because you mentioned the judicial elections. And what are the different ways that some of those are being affected by the voter suppression rules, by these changes in whether or not we're even voting? So just if you could give us a little bit more of the lay of the land and maybe what's at stake at the different levels. Does that make sense?
Sure. So for local elections, we've seen a couple of different things. We've seen the General Assembly pass what are called local acts. So this is legislation, but it applies to just one county or a couple of counties. And they've redistricted local bodies. So they redistricted, for example, the Greensboro City Council, they redrew the Wake County School Board, and they redrew the Wake County Commission. These are things that would usually be done by that body itself. The Greensboro City Council usually draws its own districts. The Wake School Board, the same thing. The Wake Commission, the same thing. But the General Assembly has the power to step in and draw those local districts if it so chooses. And so it did so in a way that made those districts very unequal in population. And welcome to the Facebook. Draw closer.
I was trying to do that more subtly.
No, I appreciate it. So they did it in a way that, they made the districts unequal. And we had experts analyze how they made these districts unequal and what could explain it. Did they do this so that the districts would be, more compactly shaped? Did they do this because they were keeping communities of interest together? Things like university campuses. Did you do it to keep that campus together? Is that why the population's off? And the experts, in isolating all of these factors, found that what drove it was 2 things: race and partisanship. They did it to advantage Republicans in those areas, in those districts, so that they could win more seats. And they did it to advantage white voters over voters of color. And so all of those plans, the Wake Commission plan, the Wake School Board plan, the Greensboro City Council plan, were struck down by federal courts and have not taken effect. So that's one way that they do the local redistricting. The other thing that we've seen locally is not a legislative act, but it's an administrative change. So after we won on the monster law in the Fourth Circuit, North Carolina's early voting period, which the monster law had cut down to 10 days. They said you could only vote early vote for 10 days. They got rid of the first 7 days of early voting after asking for and receiving information showing that voters of color disproportionately used those first 7 days. They cut the first 7 days. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said you have to reinstate the 7 days. After that happened, that court decision, the chairman of the state Republican Party sent out a memo to all of the county boards of elections. At that time, we had a Republican governor. Every county board of elections has 3 members, and the majority on the board matches the party of the governor. So every county board of elections in 100 counties had 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. This memo goes out from the state Republican Party, and he says to these 2 members on every single one of the 100 boards, we need to cut back early voting opportunities. So don't expand early voting in your counties. Even though we have to add these other 7 days, we want you to limit early voting as much as you can. This is just an administrative change. So each county board of elections held a meeting and adopted an early voting plan. And what we saw happening in all of these counties, many of these counties, was that things like evening hours for early voting were cut back. So early voting would end at 5 o'clock. So if you couldn't get there before 5 o'clock, you couldn't early vote. Saturday voting, Sunday voting were cut back. So if you couldn't get there during the week, you wouldn't have an opportunity to early vote. Satellite sites, so say that there's a site on the Duke campus for early voting. We saw a lot of sites cut on campuses and cut in heavily African-American neighborhoods. So instead of doing that, you'd have to drive down to the county seat, to the county board of elections, and cast your vote there during business hours. So that's an administrative change that just happened locally. That got appealed to the state board of elections, and we won a lot of those cases. We argued I think it was a 16-hour hearing in front of the state board of elections, of just one county after another arguing to expand early voting, to push back against this effort. But that was an effort that happened at the local level administratively, didn't require any sort of legislative act at all.
I think it's worth noting that, although I don't generally buy it, I think what the other side denies any ulterior or terrible motives in doing all this. Their argument that this is about protecting against voter fraud, it's about efficiency and saving money and running elections in a quick, efficient fashion, and it has nothing to do at all with, although the Republicans have also been pretty upfront in general when it comes to gerrymandering, that they've admitted, because at least for now it's still constitutional as far as the U.S. Supreme Court is concerned, that their maps were designed to gerrymander for partisan advantage. They deny that it was to discriminate on the basis of race, but they admit that it's been done for partisan advantage. There is a case right now before the United States Supreme Court that is challenging the constitutionality of partisan gerrymandering, that is drawing maps intentionally to elect one party or the other. And it's worth noting, and as they of course readily do, that Democrats have gerrymandered forever. That gerrymandering is a tried and true tradition of both parties in our country for more than a century, well over that. The term gerrymandering goes back to the 1800s. What you could say, however, I think, with good confidence about the current situation, is that the folks in charge now have really gotten good at this. The advent of modern digital technology allows the construction of maps in a way that is so much more effective and so much more precise in terms of how you draw them for your whatever your advantage you're trying to get for yourself, that they've really perfected it. And this has actually been true in a lot of other areas in which the Republicans have taken control. In North Carolina in the last several years, they've been much more just ambitious and less embarrassed about about what they're trying to accomplish, be it in voting rights, be it in remaking our public schools, be it in tax policy. We wrote a report a couple of years ago at NC Policy Watch. It's still on our website. It's called Altered State, how 5 years of conservative rule have redefined North Carolina. It could now be how 7+ years have done that. And you'll see that this is just, the voting rights fight is just very similar to ones that have gone on in area after area, where the newly emboldened large majorities that the Republicans have been able to secure in North Carolina has really they've just taken it and run with it. And they are unabashed, at least in the effect of what they're doing. They often, as I say, will profess to have, very bland motives that are about good government and preventing fraud, but I don't think there's any doubt about what they're trying to do. They're very committed to remaking the social contract in North Carolina, and they are and I think the battle over the courts that's taking place right now, the attempt in many ways to remake the court system, is a part of that effort. And it's also a part of their concern that they're worried that the advent of the Trump administration endangers their majorities, that these super majorities that they have right now, which allow them to override any veto that even Governor Cooper might issue, or in the past that Governor McCrory might have issued, that those could be in danger. And so now they're looking for new ways to sort of, put a lock on some of these changes that they've implemented. And since the Democrats sort of, in a surprise development, did take control of the state Supreme Court last November and now hold a 4-3 advantage, they're looking for ways to get around that. And so they've taken steps. They even considered packing the Supreme Court by adding 2 new justices last fall. They've looked at, I think, as was just referred to, they've shrunk the state Court of Appeals. They're reconfiguring how appeals work in the state, who has responsibility for what. They've created the phenomenon of en banc review on the state Court of Appeals, which is, of course, still dominated by Republicans. So it's, from my perspective, a very cynical but very effective plan to affect a change in our society that's very dramatic and to lock it in place. Anyway, going on. Sorry, I got on my soapbox. Maybe you've got another question, Lou.
I have a lot of questions.
Okay,
My next one's going to be a really naive question, which is, it strikes me as deeply unfair and undemocratic that within the state there are so many different rules for voting. So explain that to me, if one of you can. How does that come to be that we have, some areas that have longer periods of voting? They can vote on weekends. What's the legal basis for that? The foundation for this kind of disparity across the state?
I think you can address that better. I think what the other side would say is that this is the genius of local control, and that we're trying to make government be as close to the people as possible, unless they try to pass ordinances that give equal rights to LGBT people. No, we don't want to do that. But go ahead.
I don't know if I can follow that, but he's right. There's no law that says that it has to be administered uniformly across the state, and a lot of that is that we have wide discrepancies in our state, very different areas. The mountains are very different from the beach. The rural areas are very different from the urban areas. And so a one-size-fits-all plan doesn't work in North Carolina. You don't want the same plan in Mecklenburg County that you want in Bertie County, which is out in the rural eastern part of the state. There are different transportation issues, there are different facilities available, and in administering local elections, that comes out of the county budget. Right. So you have a very different ability in Wake County to pay for lots, I think they had 20 satellite sites for early voting in 2016, versus some county up in the mountains that has several thousand people and that's about it. They don't necessarily need that, and they have different realities in terms of how people are getting to the polls and where people are living, how scattered they are across the county. So it does give us some flexibility, and our system is set up that way. It's
not inherently unfair to have different rules in different communities.
Right. It's how it's administered. How they're using that flexibility. Are they using it to favor one party over another? Are they using it in ways that they shouldn't? Are they failing to listen to the voices of affected people in the community, saying, hey, it's really hard for me to get, in Northampton County all the way down to Jackson to vote. Can I keep my voting site out in Garner because we've had it forever? That's one that they tried to get rid of in the 2016 election, and we got it reinstated. Because there's no public transportation in that county, and it's rural, and people don't have transportation to get all the way down to the county seat where I think 500 people live. Most people don't live there. So you kind of have to look at the conditions in each county and decide what makes sense for the county given its budget, given where the people live, and you would hope the County Board of Elections would try to do what's fair. It's worth noting at this point that there has been a change to the County Boards of Elections initiated by the Republicans, and you can talk about
as soon as the governor was elected, a Democratic governor was elected.
So to expand the State Board of Elections, which was 5 members and had 3 members, the majority was the same party as the governor, and then the 2 members were the minority. So we had a State Board of Elections under Governor McCrory. There was 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. We had county boards of elections under Governor McCrory that were 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And the Republicans last year, I guess, this session, in the 2017 session, said we want to expand that and we want to make all these boards of elections bipartisan. And so we're going to have they expanded it to 8, didn't they? 8. So 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats on the state board of elections.
Which they merged with the State Ethics Commission. And it's now the
That's right.
Board of Ethics and Elections or something like that.
And then we're going to have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on every county board of elections. But we're going to require 3 votes to act. So that's kind of where the trouble comes in. If we do get into one of these partisan entrenchments, if we have a move to either vastly expand or vastly roll back early voting, maybe those members disagree and we get more disagreements. That's the concern about that arrangement. But they have been expanded and there's no longer the governor's party controls all the boards of elections.
Although some of that is still subject to a lawsuit challenging that the governor's challenged. There's also, isn't there also an aspect to it that the rotation of who chairs the local boards of elections? I feel like there was an addition to that as well.
Yes, the minority,
I think it works out that the Republican chair during the election years.
During the even-numbered years. Yeah. During the even-numbered years, the party that's not the governor's party would chair the boards.
What a
coincidence. During the odd-numbered years, the party that is the governor's party would chair the boards,
right,
under the current law, which is now being challenged also.
Right.
So you've talked a lot about what's going on in that kind of policy realm and administrative realm. A lot of people talk about voter ID laws, and that's something that we've talked about some that North Carolina has, it seems like it's always almost going to happen.
Right.
So what is the state of things right now in terms of voter ID laws in North Carolina? And what kinds of obstacles are individuals in North Carolina facing right now when they show up at the polls to vote? What kinds of instances have you heard of, have you encountered, of people being denied their right to vote, and what kind of justification?
Go ahead.
Let me take this one. So our voter ID law was struck down in that big decision out of the Fourth Circuit in 2016. And how our voter ID law came about was I don't know if you want me to go all the way back to the Shelby County decision. There used to be a provision of the Voting Rights Act called Section 5.
The federal, goes back to the 1960s. Yeah.
Yeah, back to the 1960s. And it required covered jurisdictions, which included 40 counties in North Carolina, whenever you're going to make a change to your election law, because you have discriminated in your elections in the past, you have to first get that change approved by the federal government. So that used to be what happened. Anytime North Carolina wanted to change its election laws, it had to go to the federal government, get permission, and then it could put the law in place. In 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States said, we have come far enough that we no longer need that pre-clearance process. You don't have to get permission anymore. And that's why after 2013, we started seeing a lot of these laws. That's the brake that was lifted. While the Supreme Court was considering that decision, before it had gotten rid of pre-clearance, the North Carolina General Assembly reached out to the DMV and to the State Board of Elections, and they asked for information on who by race had which types of IDs. And what they got back was information saying that voters of color disproportionately lacked certain sorts of IDs, including driver's licenses, but they had other sorts of IDs. They had were more likely to have public assistance IDs, were more likely to have student IDs, and so they saw, based on type of ID, which voters by race had each type of ID. Then they then the pre-clearance decision came, and we no longer had to have pre-clearance. Within days, the law was amended, and now instead of a simple voter ID law, which we had before, they had a voter ID law that was tailored to disallow the sorts of IDs that voters of color had and allow the sorts of IDs that white voters disproportionately had. So the Fourth Circuit looked at that, the fact that they had gone and gotten that information, saw what the results were, knocked out the IDs that voters of color had, and they said, you've targeted African Americans with surgical precision. So currently we do not have a voter ID requirement in North Carolina. After that decision, there has been talk at the legislature about reviving a voter ID requirement and maybe tailoring it a little differently. There's been talk about adding something that was called reasonable impediment. So if a voter had a good reason that they couldn't get an ID, like I don't have a copy of my birth certificate, or I can't get a ride to get an ID, or I don't have the money to pay for a state ID, and they made those free eventually. But if you could list one of those reasons, you could still show up, fill out an extra form, sign it under penalty of felony if you were lying, and then vote that way. Some people said that that was intimidating and it was another step that you were making voters jump through for no good reason. But there's been talk about bringing back an ID requirement that may have a provision like that or may have provisions that have survived in other states, whereas North Carolina's did not survive. So states like South Carolina has a voter ID law, Indiana has a voter ID law, Pennsylvania. That we could see another round of voter ID modeled on one of those states.
And in truth, obviously voter ID is generally, it polls pretty strongly. There's a generally support, even amongst Democrats, for the idea of voter ID, unless the poll is constructed in a way so that it's really explained to people how it can be an impediment. It's just not something that strikes the average middle-class person who has a driver's license as something that would be a burden. There's not a recognition that there are hundreds of thousands of people who don't have formal ID. So there's actually talk at the General Assembly these days, not only of reviving voter ID, but of perhaps even passing a state constitutional amendment that would, of course, it would still run into challenges at the federal level, but there's talk of passing an amendment that would then be on the ballot in 2018 at some point on the theory that this would be a popular thing for getting out voters, getting out Republican voters, and perhaps they might even attach some other provisions to it. It could be some sort of omnibus, voter privacy protection law or something to that effect, or voter integrity protection law. So it remains very much a live subject and one that I think there's good reason to be still very concerned about.
What is the constitutional amendment process in North Carolina?
Well, we're not an initiative state like a lot of states. A lot of states, I grew up in California where, you get enough signatures and it's on the ballot. Here, the legislature has to actually pass it and then put it before the voters. And so we did that with the awful Amendment 1, which was the anti-LGBT amendment. We've done it in the past with other proposals. But it's pretty unusual. But there is talk of this. There's talk of even doing it in a special session. This current General Assembly, one of the ways they've really transformed how we make laws in North Carolina is that North Carolina General Assembly historically, and I've been here 25 years, would have what's called the long session during the odd-numbered year of the biennium, and then the short session. They would come in the first year and stay from January till summer, and then they might have some studies and things in the interim, but they'd mostly stay away until the following spring. So that would be May or April of 2018, at which point they would come back, make adjustments to the two-year budget that had been passed the previous year, and maybe have a 60 or 90-day session. It'd be a pretty quick thing. The current General Assembly has transformed that a lot. They now favor coming back for special sessions. They come back for 3 or 4 days. A bill is concocted in secret and passed very quickly. This is what happened with the infamous HB 2. We've had numerous special sessions this year, and there's some expectation that there'll be, well, indeed, I think they are scheduled to return in January, which ordinarily wouldn't be the time for the return in the second year of a biennium. So these special sessions are coming, and we fear that there'll be one on this voting topic some point in the coming year. Is that what you've heard as well? That's what I'm hearing.
I've heard rumors.
Yeah. Keeping our fingers crossed. Maybe we're wrong.
So there's another type of voter suppression that I don't know whether this falls in the realm that either of you really is in your expertise, but I'm going to throw it out there,
okay.
Which of course it's something that's getting talked about a lot right now, is failure of the actual technical system. Mm-hmm. So my vote might not count because the computer failed. Like Durham had this problem on election day of the voting rolls not being accessible on the computer systems, and there was some debate, there was some concern that was the result of some hacking. So is North Carolina prepared to address this? I'll just leave it at that.
The State Board of Elections has taken steps to address that, and did on Election Day. So this was Election Day 2016. We were all staffing an election hotline where people can call in if they have any sort of problems, and we can walk them through, here's what you should do next to make sure that you can vote. And we started getting calls that, the poll books are down in Durham, the computers are down, we can't check in to vote. This line is really long, they're telling people to come back in an hour, which is problematic for people trying to vote before work. So it turns out that the poll books in, I want to say 5 polling places in Durham, might have been 6, but I think it was 5, went down, the electronic poll books. And so the county said, okay, everybody all across the county, we're not going to use the electronic poll books. We need you to pull out the paper poll books and we're going to use those. So this only applied to the check-in process. When you walk in and you first check in at the computer, you give them your name, they say, okay, this is your current address, and then they give you your stuff. We're only talking about that, not the actual vote casting process, not the ballot counting process. None of that was affected. And they, after the election, traced the problem to a third-party software from a company called VR Systems that's used in Durham County and 20 other counties in North Carolina. The Department of Homeland Security has investigated and said that they don't have any information that North Carolina was part of the Russian hacking that they're looking into. That they said North Carolina is not under suspicion of that. They suspected in 21 states, but North Carolina is not one of those 21. And so the State Board of Elections is evaluating in those 21 counties here that use that third-party software just for check-in. It didn't affect any other part of voting. What steps do they need to take in the future? Do we not use that vendor anymore? Are they going to make some sort of patch? Are they going to fix their software? And then let's have better backups in place, because all of their staff had been trained to use the computers for check-in and not to use. I mean, these are poll workers who are just
volunteers.
Basically doing this for the day. They weren't prepared to have the whole county switch into paper. We did file a lawsuit. Democracy North Carolina actually brought a lawsuit, and we represented them that day in Wake County Court, arguing to keep the polls open longer. And the polls in some of those locations were kept open longer, so that if people were turned away, they would potentially have the opportunity to go back at night if that's something that worked for their schedule. There's no guarantee that that worked for everyone, but it was, everyone who was in line later that night was allowed to vote. But that irregularity's gotten lots of attention, but the State Board of Elections has been investigating it, and the Department of Homeland Security has said that North Carolina is not part of this larger hacking that they're investigating.
And there are these two competing interests that I think certainly progressives argue more forcefully maybe than many conservatives, that we need to make voting easier, that in general voting is too hard in our country, that we need to make registration to vote much easier, or even indeed automatic for anybody who gets a driver's license, let's say. Maybe they should just be automatically registered to vote. Obviously, other states have experimented even with online voting, and we need to be moving in that direction. But the countervailing issue of security of the ballot and the need for a paper backup for the ballot is, to my way of thinking, still very important, and one that we need to, those are two very important issues, and sometimes they run counter to each other. And I think we need to keep them both in mind. But to me, making it easy to vote, good thing. Having more security in the ballot so that the Russians can't hack our elections, also a good thing.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We've focused a lot on North Carolina's laws and its voting structure. What's going on at the national level that might have an impact on voting rights in North Carolina?
Well, I can tell you about a trend that we've seen that may be picked up at the national level. So we were talking about administrative ways to keep people from voting that's not necessarily passing legislation. The State Board of Elections in our state and secretaries of state in other states, it just depends on who each state designates. But here's the State Board of Elections. They're in charge of maintaining our voter rolls and making sure that they're up to date. So making sure that if someone dies, that their name comes off the roll. Making sure that if someone registers to vote and was not qualified to register to vote for whatever reason, that they're not on our voter rolls. If someone is convicted of a felony and serving an active felony sentence, they come off our voting rolls during that time, although they're eligible for reinstatement. So what we've seen in other states in just the past few years is really aggressive efforts to purge voter rolls of people. And a lot of the time this is done based on matching with voter rolls in different states. And that matching is problematic because they'll match, say, my name and my birth date, and they'll look in all 50 states and see if I voted in 2 states in an election. Well, if someone else has my name and my birth date, which happens a lot more often than you think, then both of those people come off the voting rolls. And so they show up to vote and they're told, well, you're not registered, you can't vote. And for a lot of folks where there's not election day registration, where there's not same day registration during early voting, that's the end of the road. You just missed that election and you weren't aware that you'd been removed because you were falsely identified. There have also been protests filed and challenges filed by groups challenging large batches of people as you're a non-citizen, they shouldn't have been allowed to vote with no proof. And so we've seen mixed outcomes of those investigations. Some states just err on the side of removing, and some states will do a more thorough investigation and err on the side of not removing someone from the voter rolls. You ask about national implications. So this has been happening at the state level, and it's subject of lots of lawsuits, one of which is going to be heard in the Supreme Court next week out of Ohio. That's the Husted case. Nationally, President Trump has started his Election Integrity Commission, which has requested voter data from all 50 states. And so the states have turned over some level of voter data. And the vice chair of that commission is Chris Kobach, who runs something called the Interstate Cross-Check Program, which is the program I'm talking about with the matching. And you end up with upward of 90% false matches that are being removed. So he's the vice chair of this commission, and there's a concern that we could see a matching program on the federal level that would remove people in all 50 states based on matching that's been shown to be faulty. You could do it in a better way, but no one has done it in that better way. So that's the current concern, that on an administrative level, we're going to see more and more voter purging, either and accusing people of being registered and being dead when they're not. It's really fun when those voters show up, by the way, right? When they're challenged and they show up at the County Board of Elections and they're like, I'm not dead. Yeah, that's pretty strong evidence. Or they're accused of voting in multiple states, or they're accused of being a non-citizen. And some of these people who've been accused of these things have started bringing defamation lawsuits because they say, you put my name in a public record, the newspaper reported on it that I was committing voter fraud. I was not committing voter fraud. You just mismatched me. And so they're bringing defamation cases and seeking money damages against people who are challenging them on these bases. So it's a very hot and evolving area right now.
The hopeful national development, which is unrelated actually directly to voting rights, of course, is the gerrymandering. The fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has this case now in front of it on partisan gerrymandering. There's actually a case here in North Carolina that's in trial, gone to trial on the same subject. But if Justice Kennedy is as usual, is the one that we think will make the decision for the country, where it comes down in favor of ruling that partisan gerrymandering, at least some egregious form of it, is unconstitutional. This could be a real sea change, and I mean, I think that's the hope that many are clinging to. I think it would have been a more likely good outcome if we had Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court instead of Neil Gorsuch, but we'll see. I mean, I think that's another area maybe where there's some at least possibility of good news in this very fraught area of the law. Yeah.
I read something yesterday that the state gerrymandering case, the judge has issued an order to get a Stanford law professor to as a counselor or something like that.
Special master is the term.
But that they cannot use election results, which I think that the latter is probably to avoid partisan gerrymandering, perhaps, until the Supreme Court issues this order or that case resolves. But I was somewhat disappointed that the math professor here, that I believe has a very novel and very fair and balanced, it seems, solution, a mathematical solution to the gerrymandering. Why wasn't he instead? And his
Did he apply?
actually used for that.
Her organization brought the lawsuit.
We represent the plaintiffs in that lawsuit. The court chose the special master, and I think when a court only draws districts as a last resort, the courts are very reluctant to draw districts. And even in this case where the court has determined the General Assembly doesn't get any more chances because the districts it keeps coming back with have legal problems. They've said, we're going to hire someone with expertise. We're not going to draw it ourselves. We'll just oversee that process. So I think they wanted to go, and this is just speculation because the court hasn't said, but they went with someone who's had experience serving as a special master in a number of different states and has drawn plans in a number of different states. I think you're referring to Dr. Mattingly here, who testified, was that just 2 weeks ago, in the partisan gerrymandering trial in Greensboro. That was his first time being an expert witness. He's very new to this area, and I think his theories are strong, but I think that I suspect the court looked at that and said, we'd like someone who is basically unassailable in his experience redrawing. To your question about using partisanship, using politics and past election results in drawing the districts, that's something that legislatures are allowed to do, but when a court takes over the drawing, there's different case law that applies and says that courts shouldn't be considering the politics of the situation. They shouldn't be looking at election results. They should just be adhering to what are called traditional redistricting criteria. So things like making sure that the districts are contiguous, that they're compact, so you don't end up with a district running all the way down I-85 like we had for a long time. Those are what the court wants to follow, and making sure that they're protecting voters of color under the Voting Rights Act and using race only to that extent. So that's what the court-focused process will be on.
And presumably they thought that this special master, with having this experience, would be able to act more expeditiously in what is a very, time-constrained environment that we're in right now.
If I may ask a follow-up, are you as a plaintiff or representing the plaintiff satisfied with that special master assignment?
We think he's got lots of experience in drawing districts, and yes, I mean we'll do what the court tells us to do, but we have no reason to think that he can't do the job.
I had two questions. One of clarification. Is the judicial race in North Carolina partisan? Because I know in other states like Montana, the Democratic, Republican, Liberal, Conservative isn't allowed to come into play.
That was one of the things that the Republicans explicitly did with their changes recently. They've made them all partisan.
Oh, okay, gotcha. And then my second question is, felons in North Carolina aren't allowed to vote unless they're somehow restored the status of citizenship, which is pretty bogus and unlikely. How does that affect a lot of these voter suppression laws going on in North Carolina? And what can anything be done to sort of mitigate that huge drop in population of people who can vote?
The best thing current with the law, what it is currently, and so what it is, if you are convicted of a felony, while you are serving your sentence, so which includes any probation, you're not allowed to vote. After that, you can have your rights restored, and to do that, you just basically re-register to vote. And you need to get a certificate from the Department of Public Safety, which they theoretically hand you as you leave, as you complete your sentence, and they say, here's your certificate, you can go register to vote. A lot of people who are in that situation, though, don't know that they are able to petition and have their rights restored. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen around that issue. That's something that my organization is involved in, but we can always use more. I think that we've been successful when expressing to people who've been formerly incarcerated that you can vote for judges, at least currently in North Carolina, although there's a move to maybe appoint judges. You can vote for judges. You can vote for DAs in North Carolina. And once people hear that, they say, well, we should be voting for judges and DAs because we're getting some unfair outcomes in our justice system, and that sometimes helps turn the page and helps them tell others in the community who are in the same situation, hey, let's get our rights restored, let's go vote. So we're trying to build some momentum around that. And
it's actually my understanding North Carolina is better than a lot of other places when it comes to this. We're actually surprisingly progressive when it comes to restoring felon voting rights.
Yeah, in Florida you can't. Once you're convicted, there's no more. Yeah. There's a move this election cycle to restore that. There's a lot of money going into Florida right now to do a constitutional amendment and change that. But as of right now, once you lose the right to vote because of a felony conviction in Florida, you don't get it back ever.
Thank you.
Well, you guys today talked about how voter suppression, and particularly how the Republican Party has been playing a major role in that recently. Well, I was wondering if there's any historical examples with the Democrats partaking in gerrymandering of Democratic Party basically participating in voter suppression.
I think there's a really important historical lesson here in North Carolina that gets lost sometimes. There was a time in this state in which the Republicans were, of course, the party of Lincoln. They were the party of people of color. Democrats were the racist white supremacists in this state. I mean, that's how it was 100 years ago, maybe less than that, 70 years ago in this state. And we've gone sort of through this flip-flop. It's sort of fascinating where the ideological labels and parties have sort of switched. The Democrats, we were a one-party state dominated by right-wing Democrats who would have ideologically much, much, much more in league with the current Republican leadership. And for decades, centuries in this state, they were the architects of voter suppression and white supremacy. So that's important to note. It's also important to note that when a different kind of Democratic Party sort of evolved in the second half of the 20th century and gradually became more progressive, they still were engaged in gerrymandering for sure. I think it's worth noting that it was, there were things that are being done now that they just would have been too embarrassed to try. I don't know, they might have tried it if they thought they could get away with it. And there's arguments to be made that going from partisan judges to nonpartisan judicial races and back, the Democrats made some decisions there at that point in order to favor Democrats getting elected as judges, and I have no doubt that that's true. But it doesn't excuse it today or say that it isn't maybe worse than it's been in the past. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
People in power trying to stay in power that's true of both parties. And so if there were some landmark voting rights cases coming out of North Carolina in the 80s and 90s when the Democrats were in power and drawing districts. And right now we see there's a partisan gerrymandering case out of Maryland where the Democrats are in control and have just crazy partisan gerrymandered those districts. Same thing is happening right now in Illinois where the Democrats are in control, in Rhode Island where the Democrats are in control. So we talk about the Republicans here, not because, just because that's who's in power, that's who's doing this. And the advance in the computer software to precisely target people at the census block level has come probably in the past 10 years, and that's the same time frame that the Republicans came to power here, but Democrats came to power in other states. I think Republicans came to power in 22 state legislatures after 2010, so there's been a wave, and that's what gets a lot of the attention.
Really?
That's why
it's a perfect storm, really.
Yeah, it's the timing that leads to it being so much of this conversation being about what Republicans have done. But yes, Democrats are equal opportunity offenders.
It also should be pointed out that there's been a move. Well, first of all, I think there's been some real progress. Just in the fact that everybody knows the word gerrymandering now is emblematic of, I think, that there's been a sea change and that people in general public are much more aware of this topic. But in North Carolina, Republicans were, for the longest time when the Democrats were in power, were sponsors of legislation to implement nonpartisan redistricting. That let's create a commission of nonpartisan criteria for drawing maps, like it's been done in Iowa and some other states. And Senator Phil Berger, who is the president of the Senate, arguably the most powerful man in North Carolina politics, sponsored that legislation, I think 5 times when he was in the minority. And now he's suddenly lost his religion about it. He's not as enthusiastic about the idea, and the groups that act as sort of the echo chamber for the conservative politicians in power, the John Locke Foundation and the Civitas Institute, these groups that long championed nonpartisan redistricting have all of a sudden got kind of, well, there's problems with nonpartisan redistricting. So, you can get pretty cynical about it, but obviously both sides have been.
Can I ask that in my 4th grade social studies book about American politics you mentioned gerrymandering?
That's great. Of course, that was only about 5 years ago, right?
That's great. Hi, I'm Helen. Thanks for speaking to us today. So something that you guys sort of touched on but didn't really explicitly, where I would like more information on, is just data in general, because like you said, both parties, like the Republican Party, sought data about demographics through the DMV. So can you talk more about this? Like, who has access to what? Because I feel like a lot of partisan gerrymandering is based off of data that people get, and like, how are they getting this? How are they allowed to get this? Like, what are the rules around that? Is this like a battlefield, just like trying to get more information on people in general?
I don't really know how to answer that question.
So, for purposes of the monster voter suppression law, which is just what it's called. I'm not making up that term.
It says it right here, monster law.
I'm seeing it on a piece of paper in front of me. That's why I keep saying it. The General Assembly went to the State Board of Elections and put in a request for information, which is pretty routine. They have the power to do that, but so do citizens. And the State Board of Elections does a really good job of making its data available on its website. So if you put in a public records request, they will put it up on their website and everyone can see it, and you can see all the public records requests they've previously answered. And we have our whole public voter database available online, so you can search through it and find yourself, and it'll show you your address. A lot of our information is public in North Carolina just based on the way that our law is set up. The General Assembly also asked the DMV for information. They're subject to public records requests, so that's something that other people could get to. And then there was an email from a leader in the General Assembly to someone, and I can't remember exactly who it was, at UNC, requesting information on student IDs in the UNC system. And so that's how they got a lot of that information. And UNC is a public school, that would be subject to public records requests as well. So it's not that they got it quickly, I think, because of who they are.
Right.
But the public could also request this information, and for purposes of litigation, we do sometimes do public records requests and get that information so that we can bring it into the courtroom and show it to judges, which is how we find out, what information they had in front of them. We request the same information and get it from them and show the judge they were looking at this, and then they made these decisions to knock out these IDs. So that's for the voter suppression question. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but that is stuff you can get publicly available.
Yeah.
And organizations, Democracy North Carolina has done a lot of public records requests. ACLU has done public records requests and made those public.
Is your concern about the privacy of, more of a privacy question?
Do you see people go through other channels other than public records? Like there's a lot more data analytics tracking like social media usage and a lot of other things like purchasing patterns and stuff like that. And I know a lot of organizations do collect that kind of data. Do you see, or like...
There's no doubt that campaigns use that information all the time. The political candidates and nonprofits and 527s and all these PACs definitely make use of that information. I'm not aware of the state making use of that information in these types of
Yeah, I haven't
cases.
seen it in the course of any litigation being used, but that's probably the next frontier.
The next frontier.
Yeah.
The window dressing and the rationale that the Republican supermajority in North Carolina state legislature gives for their various legislations, voter suppression, squelching of local rule until they want to impose local rule, stacking the UNC Board of Governors. It really doesn't pass muster for anyone who thinks about it for just a few moments. So whether the acceptance has some sociological base and a tolerance for mendacity, or I don't care until it blocks my driveway, it seems like nothing's going to change until this supermajority is unseated. And it seems like a better way to unseat them is to get some changes in the redistricting, whether it's on the... I'm curious, do you view a better way to change what's occurring in the legislature, the partisan challenge before the Supreme Court, the unknown of what it means to have the current U.S. president in such hot water that maybe everything would go topsy-turvy in 2018, or something else?
It's all of the above, I think. I mean, I think, well, it could well be that the special master, if we actually get new districts in 2018 drawn by the special master, that could abet the process in the 2018 election of getting a better result. That in combination with a president whose poll numbers are in the 30s and, an amazingly energized base of progressive voters, we think that that's conceivable, that could lead to a different result. I don't think there are many people who can concoct a scenario in which the Democrats regain actual control of the General Assembly, but they might be able to sustain Cooper vetoes, which would change the calculus a lot. I personally am very hopeful that will happen, although I'm a nonpartisan. It's just an ideological battle as I see it. But I don't know, do you have...
Legislative redistricting is a big deal because the legislature is the one that does all the maps, right? The legislature draws North Carolina's congressional maps. The legislature is drawing these local maps. It's drawing its own maps. And so if the special master can give us districts that are not that are legal, right, just at a fundamental level, that are legal, then we won't have the same result, possibly, of this party that's in power entrenching itself in power. That'll be rolled back a little bit. And if we can get different people drawing the districts, the next time we draw districts is in 2021, after we get the 2010 census.
2020 census.
Sorry, 2020 census back. And we see how the population has moved around. We'll have to draw new districts. So the legislature that's in place in 2021 is going to be a big deal. And to the extent that this special master process helps us get to a less entrenched and more legally constituted legislature, that is very helpful.
Although it should be noted, when I arrived here, I'm sure many of you remember this, that North Carolina was the last state to actually give the governor the veto of legislation. When I arrived here in 1992, I was shocked to discover that our governor could not veto a bill. We were the last state in the union. And when they amended the Constitution in the 1990s to give the governor the veto, they made sure it didn't apply to redistricting. So, the majority, whether it's a supermajority or not, will have its way with the next set of maps, which leads you to believe that there probably, almost assuredly, will be more litigation in the future on this issue.
Thanks a lot for such clarity on all these things. Really incredibly useful. It's always struck me as sort of a funny political argument, right, to sort of have a process in which you're admitting that if everyone voted, you would lose, right? Or in some sort of sense, or that, and that you come into power and then you spend a huge amount of that time in power, sort of making that argument in a sort of way. It's kind of goes through. In other words, you're kind of publicly admitting in some ways that you may be unpopular, right? As a party, I don't know. And I don't know whether opponents
deny that, but
right.
Yeah.
I know, but I mean,
I
wonder if there's a political possibility of making that point. You know, if this were any other competition, right? You would sort of say, look, you're admitting in advance that you can't play by the rules, etc. And I don't know if that can come into. I know we've never found a way to kind of do that, but because it would apply in both directions, right? Whoever's out.
We try, and I think more people are coming around. I mean, the problem here is that the other side has billions upon billions of dollars to spend on propaganda. Yeah, how to target voters, and so it's a constant fight, and it's a vexing debate that we're in the midst of right now. I go on with the folks from the John Locke Foundation every Friday on WUNC radio. We do a little 8-minute segment, and it's just, I think she really believes that stuff she's saying. I really do think she's convinced that it's true. I mean, to me, it's so patently absurd, but.
I mean, it's straight. I guess the question I have partly is about the long-term history. So, because before the Voting Rights Act, right, the democratic kind of white supremacist order of the early 20th century, we think of it as sort of basically based on an open racial appeal. Although their technologies of denying vote also were very kind of granular too. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a kind of genealogy of techniques. Obviously, the new technology allows for different kinds of techniques. But I'm always struck when you study sort of Jim Crow era voting. It was also, part of the brilliance in some ways is to do things that makes it seem like the voter's at fault, right? Like at the end of the day, well, you could have come. Maybe you just didn't really want to vote if you weren't going to drive to. Right? There's a way in which it turns it back on the person. The way that literacy tests or others also make.
And we know that there's a kernel of truth in there, that voters in North Carolina and around the country are negligent and don't, and many who could vote easily don't vote.
Yeah,
and
the voting rates are.
So there's a narrative out there already that this taps into and that resonates with a lot of people. It makes it very complicated.
There's one more question.
This is possibly more of a theoretical or a hypothetical question, but some countries have mandatory voting laws.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether they don't actually have to have conversations about voter suppression. So I wonder, it's highly unlikely that the United States will ever kind of arrive at that kind of democratic system. But what would be different about North Carolina or about the United States if everyone had to vote?
Oh my gosh.
I could definitely see that feeding mass incarceration if we keep up at the rate that we are right now, suppressing votes of people of color, which would be a nightmare. If everybody had to vote, I think that we would have to figure out more ways to expand access to the ballot, which was a trend that we saw in North Carolina up until 2010. In 2008, we were one of the top states in the nation for opportunities for voting and expanding opportunities for voting. And that's why it's been so hard for people in the state to see that rolled back. I think we kind of built
There's a lot of hard-fought victories, in lots of areas that the Democrats kind of finally came around, and a lot of areas in voting was one of them. And that's what made this especially bitter when it was rolled back so quickly, as it was in a lot of other areas.
And
Go ahead,
if it were required, then we'd have to start moving down that track again and make sure that people would have realistic opportunities to vote, so that, I don't know what the penalty would be, but so that they wouldn't suffer the penalties of not being able to.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I agree. I think it's almost impossible to imagine that happening any time in the foreseeable future in our country. But, the idea of getting more people to vote, I think it would have a positive result in general. I think that when you poll people on lots of important bread and butter issues in this country, I think that the body politic is more progressive than the policies that are, implemented in our country. So I think we'd have a very different looking government in our country. But I don't know that I'd be in favor of that. I would be in favor, however, of the idea of some sort of automatic registration and some sort of, there's always this argument put forth by the other side that we just can't spend all this money. We don't want to spend this money on public financing for elections or
This little minor thing.
yeah, to me, right. It's like what more central to a democracy could you spend money on than making sure that everybody has the opportunity to vote and that it's as easy as possible and that it's as foolproof as possible. All those things are eminently doable things that a real forward-looking progressive government, I think, could implement and should implement and I think will implement sometime in the 21st century.
Well, I'm going to ask the final question, which is,
not everybody in this room is a lawyer. Or working with an organization like this. So without that tool, those tools available to us, what are the things that are available to us as citizens who want to increase access to voting? What should we be doing?
Well, what we do at NC Policy Watch is we believe we're engaged in the battle of ideas with the other side, that there is a fight for the soul of our state and our country that's underway. The other side with whom we do battle, and I think this predates Trump and is much bigger than Trump, has a very different vision of what they want our society to look like. And they are, to their great credit, or at least I admire them for their stick-to-itiveness, for the fight that they're putting up. They are serious about this. They work every day on it. They have large numbers of devoted followers who are active in social media, who speak out, who call into talk radio, who get out and vote, who get out and organize. All those basic aspects of participating in democracy, they do it, and they do it better than progressives, and they pay much better attention and closer attention to state-level debates. Progressives, especially, I think of my peeps, the people that I'm, who are our dearest followers at NC Policy Watch, tend to be the folks that are, around college campuses and in Chapel Hill and the progressive communities in the state, and they're all fixated on what Robert Mueller is doing and what's going on in Washington, and I admire that, and I'm interested in that too. But I'll tell you, one area where the right kicks our butts is they pay attention to what's going on. They know who the Speaker of the House is. Whenever I go on conservative talk radio, I'm inundated with calls of people who know all the bills that are going on in the General Assembly. So if we just paid more attention, to what's going on, I understand why you don't want to. It's sort of ugly to look at what's going on in Raleigh, and it's not always a very impressive crew of people that are running our state, and it's easy to just be disgusted and want to look away. But I really think that's, if there's a number one thing for progressives and people who care about this, it's to pay attention, it's to be speaking out, it's to be on social media, it's to be informing yourself so that you can inform your friends and family about. And if we just up the numbers of people who pay attention to state government by a few percentage points, I think it could make a big difference. That's my little sermon on this stuff.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah.
I can't add anything to that.
Well, and I guess just to broaden it from just what progressives should be doing, what you've just said is really what everybody should be doing, is paying attention to what's going on at the local level, at the state level, and get involved.
I think we'll have better results. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you.
Thank you guys.